All right, in this video I'm going to go over a little bit more about how the graph for a sine and cosine function relates to what's happening on the unit circle. All right, so suppose we have this question. On 0 to 2 pi, solve sine of x is equal to 0. So let's talk about what this interval means, 0 to 2 pi. Well, what that's saying is, let's just look at the graph between 0 and 2 pi. Now, if it didn't have this interval and it just said solve sine of x is equal to 0, well, there are many places on this sine graph where the graph hits 0. It hits 0 here, 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 and it keeps hitting 0. And there's an infinite number of places where that happens. So because we have this interval, we just want to know, when does this curve hit 0? And because we have a square bracket on 0, we're going to include 0, but the parenthesis means we don't include 2 pi. So where within this interval does the graph hit 0? Well, it hits 0 here and here. So we would say that the solutions are 0 and pi. We don't include 2 pi because 2 pi is not included in this interval. And let's relate that to what's happening on the unit circle. So between 0 and 2 pi, well, 0 is at this position, this position right here, and if we go all the way around the circle, 2 pi finishes out the circle. So what this is saying is 1 time around the circle, or around the unit circle. Okay, so it's saying in that first rotation around the unit circle, when is sine equal to 0? Well, sine is equal to 0 when the y-coordinate is equal to 0. So that is happening here, and then it happens here, and because we're not including 2 pi again, we don't want to mention this position twice. So we would say at 0 radians and at pi radians. Similarly, we could say 0 degrees and 180 degrees. Okay, so that's how we solve that question. Now let's say on the interval 0 to 2 pi, where are the max values? Now it's just saying, when does this curve reach its highest point? Well, the highest points are going to be here, and so within that interval, there's only one position that has a maximum value. So where does this happen? This happens at pi over 2. Okay, the maximum value is 1, and it occurs at pi over 2. Think about what's happening on the unit circle. We want to know, when does the sine value have its greatest value? And it happens up here. The sine value corresponds to the y-coordinate. The greatest y-coordinate occurs at pi over 2, or 90 degrees. And then lastly, on the interval 0 to 2 pi, solve sine of x is equal to 1/2. Now this is saying, when does sine of x equal 1/2? In other words, when does the graph hit 1/2? Well, 1/2 is about right here. So it looks like it hits at this position and this position. Now, it's hard to know precisely from the graph where that is happening, but if we think about this on the unit circle, it's saying, where does a sine value equal 1/2? We want to solve for x, and remember, whatever is going into a function is always an angle. So we're trying to figure out what angle has a sine value of 1/2. Sine is the y-coordinate, so it's going to be here and here. So if we want this in radians, it's going to be 5 pi over 6 and pi over 6. So there are actually two values here that give us a sine value of 1/2. All right, so now let's do a couple similar questions for the cosine function. So on the interval 0 to 2 pi, so 0 to 2 pi, 2 pi, when does this curve equal to, is it equal to 0? Well, it's equal to 0 here, equal to 0 here. So we would say x is going to be pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. And again, how does this relate to what's happening on the unit circle? Well, cosine is the x-coordinate. We have an x-coordinate of 0 here and here. So those angles are pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. We could also say 90 degrees and 270 degrees. Next, we want to know what the minimum value is between 0 and 2 pi and where that value occurs. So looking at the graph, the minimum value is just the lowest point on the curve. So the minimum value is -1. Where does that occur? That occurs when x is equal to pi. All right, so on the unit circle, when we're talking about cosine, we're concerned with the x-coordinate. What is the smallest x value? So going this way, the smallest x value that we get is this position right here. Because the coordinates it's cut off are -1, 0. So -1 is the smallest x value that we ever get, and that occurs at pi. If we're in radians, or in degrees, it's 180 degrees. And one more. Between 0 and 2 pi, solve cosine of x is equal to -√3 over 2. Again, we want x to be an angle because angles go into the trig functions. So this is saying what angle or what x value gives us a cosine value of -√3 over 2. So -√3 over 2 is maybe here. So it looks like it's happening here and here. So there's two positions. And again, we can't really see this very precisely on the graph, but on the unit circle, we're looking, when does cosine have an x value that's -√3 over 2? It's here, it's cut off, but it's also right here. Okay, so those angles, x is going to be 7 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6. I'm writing them backwards for some reason. Similarly, we could say 210 degrees or 150 degrees. Now, I'm just realizing we don't want to actually say this in degrees because this interval is in radians. So because the interval is in radians, we want our solution to also be in radians. If the interval was 0 degrees to 360 degrees, then we would give our solution in degrees. So this is how we know whether our solution should be in radians or degrees based on the format of that interval.